All right, welcome. What we're doing today is a little different. We're not just going to cover a topic, we're actually going to demonstrate a tool. It's a method for seeing the hidden architecture that connects our world, from the way we tell ancient stories to the way we build modern technology. Let's get started. So let's kick things off with a pretty radical question. What if the story of a fallen god from way back in the 2nd century and the training process for a cutting-edge AI, what if they're just two completely different languages describing the exact same operational sequence?
You know, we tend to keep all our knowledge in separate boxes. We've got physics over here, psychology over there, and mythology, well, that's usually packed away in the attic. But this separation, it stops us from seeing the deeper, underlying structures that actually connect them all.
Now, hold on. I want to be really clear about something right up front. This is not about finding loose metaphors. This isn't some kind of quantum mysticism, okay? Seeing a face in a cloud doesn't mean the cloud is a person. We're talking about something way more rigorous, structural isomorphism. That means a direct one-to-one mapping of functions.
Exactly. So, to prove this isn't just about finding pretty metaphors, let's try a little experiment, a blind test. I'm going to describe a process based only on its functional architecture, and your job is to try and figure out what system I'm describing. Okay, here's the sequence. Listen closely. First, a system is in a state of stability. Then it creates a control interface, basically a simplified model of reality, and it starts mistaking that model for the real thing. Well, inevitably, this leads to a breakdown when the model runs into something it just can't handle. That breakdown triggers a chaotic but creative search for a new model, a phase we'll call reconfiguration. And finally, the system finds a solution and enters reintegration, stabilizing at a higher, more complex level.
So, any guesses? What system does that sound like to you?
Well, if you're coming at this from a modern perspective, the answer's actually pretty clear. This is the textbook definition of a complex adaptive system. In short, it's a learning algorithm.
And you see this pattern everywhere in modern science. For a neuroscientist, it's predictive processing. The brain predicts, fails, and then rewires itself. It's the scientific method itself. You hypothesize, you test, you fail, you revise. It's literally how we train AI models, and it's the core of cybernetics. You build a model, you break it against reality, and you rebuild it stronger.
And yeah, you'd be absolutely right. But here's where it gets really interesting. That exact same 5-step learning algorithm also perfectly describes an ancient cosmological system once you strip away all the spiritual labels.
This exact 5-step process, it is the narrative arc of 2nd century Gnosticism. Their state of perfect stability, they called it the pleroma. The flawed control interface that mistook itself for reality, that was the demiurge. The catastrophic breakdown was the fall. The chaotic process of reconfiguration they called metanoia, which literally means to change one's mind. And that final reintegration was the soul's return to wholeness.
And I really want to hammer this point home. These systems aren't just kind of similar. They are structurally identical. They are isomorphic. They share the exact same operational logic, just expressed in completely different languages.
It's really striking. It's as if we've found a kind of Rosetta Stone for reality. On one side, you have the language of myth and story. On the other, the language of algorithms and function. And by comparing them, we can actually translate between the two. And just to be super clear on this, isomorphism means a one-to-one mapping where the structure is preserved. Think about a clock face with Roman numerals versus one with Arabic numerals. The symbols are totally different, but the underlying logic, the way it tells time, is identical. We're saying we can do the same thing with entire systems of meaning.
So let's actually use this Rosetta Stone. Let's translate. In the Gnostic myths, the demiurge is often seen as this arrogant, blind, lesser god, the villain of the story. But what happens when we translate that from story to function? Well, a generative model in AI creates a simplified simulation of reality. It's blind to anything outside its own parameters. The Gnostics called the demiurge the blind god for the same reason. It thinks its simulation is the entire universe.
Exactly. So the arrogance of the demiurge is just the functional limitation of a model that can't see beyond its own training data. And this translation works for their other terms too. The archons, these cosmic rulers who block the soul's ascent, they function as regulatory systems, the feedback loops in any system that resists change. And the kenoma, or the great void, isn't a place. It's the functional state when your predictive model simply goes offline.
You know, this whole thing is a lot like the history of chemistry.
The alchemists used all these amazing symbolic terms like green dragons and red lions, but they were describing real chemical reactions. When we discovered the periodic table, we didn't lose the reaction. We just gained a much more precise language for it. We're doing a similar translation here, from the language of myth to the language of systems theory.
And this brings us to the practical application. I mean, this isn't just some cool academic exercise. It acts as a truth detector. We can use this framework to analyze the viability of any system, whether it's political, psychological, or spiritual. We can stop asking, is this story literally true, and start asking, does this system follow the invariant architecture of reality?
So let's run a system through this litmus test. Think about totalitarian ideologies. What do they promise? Permanent stability and absolute control. Steps 1 and 2, forever. They claim to have ended history, which explicitly denies the necessity of breakdown and reconfiguration. By doing that, they violate the fundamental laws of all complex systems, which makes them inherently brittle and, ultimately, destined to fail.
And that right there brilliantly illustrates the core insight. Crisis, breakdown, suffering, these aren't bugs in the system. They are necessary functional features. You simply can't evolve from a simple state to a more complex one without passing through the controlled chaos of step 4, that reconfiguration phase.
So the key takeaway here is this. Understanding itself is a technology. It isn't about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about learning to recognize the underlying patterns, the invariant processes that repeat themselves at every single scale of reality.
And this technology can fundamentally shift your perspective on a personal level. Think about it. When you're facing a major crisis, the old narrative is, I am broken. This tool lets you reframe that entire experience functionally. My system is in step 4. I am reconfiguring. Now, that might not take away the pain, but it can remove the panic that comes from feeling that the pain is just pointless.
You know, when we learn to see this pattern playing out everywhere, we're not just learning about ourselves. We are tracing the fundamental logic of existence. In a very real sense, we are discovering the signature of a universe that remembers its own structure, through us, at every scale.
Look, the goal here isn't to declare a winner between ancient myth and modern science. It's to learn to see the architecture that underpins both of them. We've just given you the tool, a blueprint for a new kind of understanding. The only real question left is, what are you going to build with it?